Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. Thank you also for your practice note on the consumer duty and what it means for insurance intermediaries. Much appreciated, and thanks for joining us to share some further thoughts on the FCA's consumer duty. Can you start by summarising what it means for insurers and intermediaries?
Yeah, thanks, Edward. So the Consumer Duty is a new regulatory regime being introduced by the Financial Conduct Authority in July 2023, and it's going to apply across the whole breadth of the financial services industry. So it'll be relevant to anyone really operating in that field, but in particular insurers and brokers and other types of intermediaries. So it's something which is very much a live issue for the industry now. What it is at heart is the consumer duty is an expectation whereby firms need to be acting to deliver what the FCA calls good outcomes for consumers. Now, this is to be measured by way of a series of individual rules, requirements, and sort of subtopics which the FCA have set out. This includes things such as expecting firms to show they're acting in good faith to consumers, to act to avoid causing any foreseeable harm, and acting in a way that helps customers and consumers meet their own financial objectives. Now, on the face of it, the consumer duty sounds similar to the sort of principles we probably already know, like treating customers fairly. But the consumer duty goes one step further, and it really puts an onus on firms to be able to provide hard data, metric evidence to the FCA to show how they're going about complying with this new duty. And one of the things that the FCA expects firms to have in operation now is what they call their implementation plan. And this is effectively a roadmap for firms to show how they're going to go about preparing for the implementation of the duty come July. So what steps they're taking, what reviews they're carrying out, and what work generally is being done internally to make sure that come July, they're ready to go. So it's quite important to note the FCA are taking a very proactive approach to the new duty now. They're actively now starting to approach firms, knock on doors and say, where are you at in terms of your preparations? Do you have your implementation plans? Can we see a copy? What's generally going on? So the firms need to be ready to go come July and really be engaging with material now from the FCA. And my colleague Dan Meyer will shortly give us a few more specific examples of issues which insurers and intermediaries may wish to consider. But Edward, if you have any thoughts, please do let us know. We're happy to chat.
Yes, and I was actually going to ask you, Daniel, what particular sort of practical and commercial challenges do you foresee that the consumer duty will pose for insurers and intermediaries?
Thanks, Edward, and thank you for collaborating with us on this one. I think, as Dan explained, the consumer duty is a significant shift for firms across the financial services sector, and it's no different for insurers and insurance intermediaries. But there are some specific challenges that insurers and insurance intermediaries are going to need to work through and make sure they've got in place in time for the implementation deadline. There's a challenging timeline that has been set for the consumer duty. It's quite a lot to get done in quite a short period of time. And the consumer duty is a significant shift that requires a shift in mindset. And it's going to be particularly challenging, I think, across the financial services sector for firms to get that change in mindset embedded across the firm in time for the implementation deadline. On the 25th of January, it was an interesting publication by the FCA that they made, publishing a review of the implementation plans that they had selected to review during the process. The FCA found firms were all at different stages with their implementation plans. I think that's reflective of what we've seen as a firm advising our clients in the insurance sector and across the wider financial services sector. Some firms are doing really well, getting the changes embedded. Others are perhaps lagging behind a little bit. And the FCA in that review advised firms to do three things. The first of those was to prioritise. The second was to embed the changes, and the third was to work together. And one of the key bits of guidance that we've got for the insurance sector is for insurers and insurance intermediaries to really work together in implementing the duty. The FCA also followed it up with portfolio letters, including one specifically for the insurance portfolios, both the life insurance portfolio and the general insurance portfolio. And that letter contains some things that firms should be focusing on. And a lot of those are actually things we've put in the practice note and given firms guidance on, things like getting fair value right, what good outcomes look like in that, and data management, making sure that brokers are working even harder for that commission that they're charging, things like scheme policies for insurers and insurance intermediaries have their own specific issues. If you're selling a product that's a bespoke targeted product, it really does need to provide a good outcome for that specific target market. And claims and renewals, I think, are two things that we would say are a challenge for insurers and insurance intermediaries in particularly. Insurance intermediaries are going to need to have a more active role in claims and renewal. And this could actually cause some conflict with insurers, with the broker really having to have a more active role in finding a good outcome for their clients. We've also, gazing into the crystal ball in the future, I think a challenge that may come along is in complaints and claims. There's a higher standard set by the Consumer Duty, and the FCA has been very clear it is a significant shift and a higher standard. And so that will come along with firms, when they don't meet that higher standard, possibly getting increases in claims and complaints. So it's very important to make sure you've done everything correctly to get the Consumer Duty implemented. And there are clearer routes for the FCA to enforce arising from the Consumer Duty. And as we've probably all seen recently, the FCA is definitely becoming a more active regulator. So it's becoming more and more important to make sure that firms are getting this correct. And we've tried to help out in our practice note with some hopefully helpful tips.
Mm-hmm. I think it's pretty clear to everyone that the standards required of insurers and insurance intermediaries is going to raise, and there'll be more transparency, I think, from the customer's point of view as to who's getting paid for what. But this follows, as you said, from previous treating customers fairly regulation. We know that the bar is going to rise. Question, I think, is by how much? And I wondered looking into your crystal ball again, I wondered how much do you see this as treating customer fairly plus a few enhancements, or do you recognise, or do you expect some kind of total paradigm shift where the interests of the customer are put perhaps ahead of the interests of shareholders?
It's an interesting question. I think the duty is fairly fluid in terms of how firms will need to embed it going forwards, and because if you need to deal with delivering good outcomes for consumers, what an outcome for one consumer is may be different for another consumer. So firms need to take a bit of a proactive and fluid approach to this. But in response to your question, I think it just goes beyond treating customers fairly. It is much more metric in nature. Firms really need to be able to evidence what they're doing to show the FCA in black and white, these are steps we've taken, this is our plan, this is how we're embedding it, these are the results, ideally as well. So results could be showing a reduction in number of complaints received, or costs of premiums, for example, decreasing, or general customer satisfaction scores if they get surveys back. So it's much more nuanced in that respect. I think firms have to really be able to give the data to the FCA, and it's not just a general principle to adopt going forward. It's something you have to show how you're doing it.
It's quite clear, I think, that the FCA means business here. Given the challenging timeframes, we may actually see how it lands sooner rather than later. So yes, watch this space.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's correct. And there was actually one of the consultation responses to the Consumer Duty from one of the groups that responded was that there will be almost a sort of a watermark for the Consumer Duty will be if there is a significant increase in complaints arising from the implementation of the duty. So I think firms definitely need to take this seriously and definitely need to make sure that they're implementing it properly.
The tension that you referred to between the relationship between the intermediaries and insurers, you spoke about the importance of working together to achieve good outcomes, but also about the pressure that intermediaries may find themselves under, as often they are producers of the relevant products. But the transparency of commission will make it incredibly visible to the customers who's doing what and where the value is being delivered. So we shall see how they deal with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the FCA has been, really kind of having a laser focus on commissions recently across all sectors that it regulates. So that really is an area to prioritise, I think, for firms.
And the FCA is showing it through general correspondence with firms on other matters as well, relating to the general FCA process. So if a firm is already authorised and is going through a change of control process or some other type of change to what's going on, the FCA is starting to ask those firms when reviewing these applications, what are you doing about the Consumer Duty? Because this is coming in 6 months' time. So they are now 5-6 months away, making their efforts known to show they're engaging with this.
Yes, and indeed with their lawyers to make sure that they get it right.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much, both. That was great, and it's been a pleasure collaborating with you on this content, and no doubt we shall continue to do so in the future.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edward.
Okay.